Hey everybody, welcome to another training video for village group leaders. Today we want to talk about what community groups actually are. That may not be the most exciting thing, it's not super nuts and bolty today, but if you want to lead a group at some point, you probably should know what groups actually are, how to define them, how to understand them, how we understand them, how they fit into the mission of the church, all of that stuff. It's super, super important. And so my hope is that if you guys are wanting to lead a group, that you are currently part of one and maybe have been part of one for a long time. And so what I want you to do, even though you may have had lots of experiences within groups, you've lived in that world for a while, you may not have ever tried to define what a community group is. And so I want you to take a minute. I'm going to ask you to pause the video a few times in the course of this little session to have you read something or reflect on something. I want you to pause the video now and just jot down somewhere how you would define a community group at the village. So go for it. Pause the video, jot that down, and then come back. So assuming you have jotted that down, my guess is that if we asked a bunch of other people to jot down a definition as well, we would get just as many different definitions as people, because we often define things by our experiences, what we see from the outside. And so just as different people bring different expectations and have different gifts, and different churches have different ways of doing things and all kinds of stuff, you get all these different understandings and definitions of what a community group is. And so for us at the village, we just want to try to simplify kind of how we see in general what community groups are and how they fit into the life of the village church. So for us, community groups are smaller, more intimate expressions of the village church. And so what we mean when we say that, to give some context, is that if we were to look at the New Testament, look at the Bible, and see how it talks about the church, there are kind of two categories of church that we see in the New Testament. We see the universal church, and we see the local church. All right, so we see the universal church, which is basically all believers from all points in time, in all places. That's the church. It's all the saints, all the people of God. The Bible talks about the church in that way many, many times. But it also talks about the church that meets in so-and-so's house, the church that gathers in such and such a city. And so we also see these localized expressions or local churches. And so we have the universal church, we have the local church, which are contextualized, localized expressions of the universal church. And then for us at the village, we have community groups, which are neighborhood expressions or just smaller, more intimate expressions of the village church. So kind of working from the outside in. And so what that means is that while community groups might be just as different as all the people that are in it, that make it up, there are some things that ought to tie our groups together, ought to fit it underneath the mission of the village, and ought to fit it underneath kind of the life and the mission of the church as a whole. And so just as there are different people and different giftings, we are all united, all of our groups, by the same mission, and that's just discipleship. That is making, maturing, and multiplying disciples. That's the mission of all of our groups, because that's the mission of the village. And that's the mission of the village because that's the great commission that Jesus gave to all of us, any of us who are believers, disciples of Jesus. And so I want to clarify what that mission is, because it's incredibly important in the way that mission fleshes itself out, not just the village, but in our groups as well. So I want you to take just a minute, pause the video again. I want you to open up your Bibles to Matthew 28 and read verses 16 through 20. You've probably read this and heard this a million times. It's the Great Commission. But I want you to consider what Jesus is actually calling us to and what that means for us, because it might be a little bit different than maybe you've heard before. So pause the video, read that, and consider what the mission really is that Jesus is calling us to. So if you are back, I'm assuming you've read that and kind of kicked that stuff around a little bit. Look, the mission of the church isn't just to make converts. All right, that's oftentimes how the Great Commission is understood. It's a mission just to simply go out, get people to make a decision for Jesus, and join a church, and then that's it. That's the Great Commission, and that is part of it. Making converts is actually part of the Great Commission, right? Jesus tells us that we are to make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? That assumes a couple things. Number one, it assumes that we are actually hanging out with non-believers, spending time with people that aren't in the church. So it assumes that. It also assumes that we are sharing the gospel with those people too. Maybe those two things right there challenge us as to whether or not we're being obedient to the mission that Jesus has given us. So it does assume that we are actually trying to bring people into God's family, inviting them to trust into Jesus. That part is true, but that's not all the Great Commission is. It's not just trying to convert people. Really, what it also encompasses is this lifelong sense of discipleship, right? Because there is the baptism piece, but the other aspect of that too is that, gosh, he calls us to teach folks to observe all that Jesus has commanded. We fall under that as people that need to be taught to observe all that Jesus has commanded, and that's something that we are to help other people do, is to help folks observe all that Jesus has commanded. And so I don't think there's any class. There's not one way of sharing the gospel. There's no set of seminars or classes. There's no sermon series that just can encapsulate absolutely everything that Jesus has ever commanded us, let alone to teach us and show us how to observe all that Jesus has commanded us, right? And so there's a couple of assumptions or things that go along with kind of that half of the Great Commission, and that's that, number one, we're not just teaching people what Jesus taught and what Jesus commanded, we are teaching them to observe what Jesus commanded. So that just means that it's not just head knowledge. We're not just dispensing information. Discipleship is more than just downloading info. It is about heart change and transformation and obedience and trusting Jesus, not just intellectually, but trusting him with our whole lives, that we would follow him and let him be the king over our daily lives. And so application is just as much a part of this as information, and all of that comes underneath transformation. So that is one assumption that is made by this half of the Great Commission. The other half is, again, like there is no one class, one sermon series, one book that encapsulates everything that we need to know and do in regards to that. And we know, gosh, that because of our flesh, because of sin, our ongoing need to be sanctified, that this is just going to be a lifelong battle, right? Things that you know you should do, like Paul in Romans 7, he knows he shouldn't do stuff, he does it anyway, right? And he knows he shouldn't do things, and he does those, and he knows he should do and doesn't. All of that stuff, there's just this inner war that he experiences that you and I experience too. No matter how much we know or how much we think that we know, there's always room for growth. And so all of this is a lifelong commitment to discipleship, both for ourselves and for the people that we seek to disciple. So the mission is just way bigger than simply making converts, all right? It is lifelong discipleship. So that informs the way that we go about doing that at the Village, and it certainly informs the way that we go about doing that within our community groups, right? One aspect of that, which is important, is that we want to obviously multiply churches. We want to plant churches because hopefully if we're on mission, we are making new disciples, and at some point, like our church is too big, it's at capacity, or we see that there's an opportunity and there's people that are called to plant a church and lead a church in some other neighborhood or in some other community, and so we want that to happen. Similarly, we want that to happen for our groups as well. As groups get bigger or as we draw people from different neighborhoods, we want to plant gospel communities in those neighborhoods. In fact, that's our vision. Our desire is that wherever the Village happens to touch a particular neighborhood, that there would be an expression of the Village Church in that neighborhood through a community group. And honestly, we want that to happen in places where there's not. The Village hasn't reached yet. That's our vision. That's our desire. We would love to see that happen. So we want to plant churches for sure, we also want to plant groups, and that's why we want to train and raise up leaders, new leaders of new groups, because we want to be part in facilitating God's mission to certainly mature us as believers, but certainly to multiply and to make new disciples as well. So, gosh, if you guys know me at all, then you probably know that sometimes I like to help define things, to say what things are, actually by talking about what they aren't. I think that's super helpful because all of us bring, again, expectations to the table when it comes to really anything. But certainly when it comes to small groups or community groups or life groups, whatever your experience has been with that part of church life, we all have that. And so I want to say a few things about what community groups aren't. Number one, it's not just one kind of thing. All right, so it's not just a Bible study. It's not just a prayer meeting, not just a friends group. It's not just a mealtime. It's not just a service team, right? It's not just one kind of thing, because the church isn't one kind of thing. It's not just kind of a one-note song or a one-hit wonder over and over and over again. It encompasses a lot. It really encompasses all of life, because discipleship is all of life. What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video. I want you to read Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. Again, this is a passage that you may have heard of before when it comes to figuring out what does the local church look like. But I want you to read it and just consider, gosh, what are all the things that seem to be happening within the early church? So take a minute, pause the video, and go read Acts 2, 42 through 47. All right, so if you're back listening to this, I'm assuming you have read that. Man, there are all kinds of things that the early church does, right? There's teaching going on, there's fellowship, there's meals and breaking bread, there's generosity, there's sharing, there's giving up stuff. There's just all kinds of things that are happening within the early church. And so, while it's not just a one-hit wonder, there are a ton of things going on, but on the other end of the spectrum, we also can't look to community groups as being a one-stop shop for absolutely everything that you will ever need for discipleship. So it's not just a one-hit wonder. It's also not playing all the hits all the time, all right? So you're going to need to plug into a Bible study. Like, you should want to be studying in depth the scriptures in some way. You're going to want to be doing one-on-one discipleship or 2-to-2 or 3-to-3 kinds of discipleship. You should want to be doing that kind of stuff. You're going to need counsel probably at some point in your life. You're going to need to invite pastors into your life at some point. You're going to want to join a serve team. Right, or join a city serve team. You're going to want to volunteer in place. You're going to want to spend time with your own neighbors. Right, there are friends in the church that may not be part of your community. You're going to want to spend time with them as well. So, look, groups aren't meant to be everything to everybody at all times. That's also just an unrealistic expectation. They're not set up to do that. So, they're not just a one-hit wonder. They're not also playing all the hits all the time. But groups also aren't just for believers. And this is super important. There's some discussion about that and philosophical differences amongst other churches. But look, gosh, we want non-believers to feel welcome into a community group. If a non-believer would feel unwelcome, it would be awkward for them. If it would be if you are afraid, or if other people in your group are afraid to invite someone who doesn't know Jesus into your community group, then I think that's a miss. We shouldn't see the introduction or arrival of a non-believer into our community group gatherings as a disruption to the mission of our group. In fact, that person's presence there is the mission. Right? We should want to make disciples. That's an opportunity that we have to invite someone to be part of God's family, to show them what it's like to be part of that, to speak truth, to love them well. And so non-believers being part of your community group isn't a disruption or an interruption to what should be going on. Like, that is part of what should be going on, right? And so there's certainly dynamics that change and shift based on who is there. So a group gathering that's just believers might look different than a group gathering that also has some unbelievers in it. And that's okay. That's good, because again, like, it's not meant to be a one-stop shop for everything for believers only. Otherwise, we are forsaking part of the mission that we're called to, and we're not really expressing the local church in its fullness, right, in our little small group. So those are some things that community groups are, I want to talk about some things that groups are for, that they're good for. Number one, they're good for care, right? And so if you have seen the org chart for the village, you know that one side is all about tasks and getting stuff done and doing things, serving, all that stuff are our teams and team leads and deacons. And the other side is caring for people. It's our groups and all of that. We have 130 some active members of the village right now, and one or two or three or four pastors can't be in all of those people's lives all the time. It's too much. And so we want to invite other people to share in that care. So that's a practical logistical help for us, that groups get to be a front line for discipline, for shepherd care, for celebrating stuff that's going on in life, to bearing burdens with people, for discipleship. But also, like, that's literally what Jesus calls us to as well. He doesn't call only pastors or only staff people to do the ministry. He calls the whole church to do the ministry. And so in one sense, care is a huge aspect of what groups offer to the church, how it fits into what we are called to do as the local church. It gives us ownership, gives people in the church ownership. You can't really spectate very easily in a community group like you maybe could in a Sunday morning. And so we want folks, there's no script, as part of groups. And so you get to bring your gifts to bear and let those things be expressed, whether it's hospitality or teaching or prophecy and prayer or whatever it might be. You get to use your gifts for the building up of the people that are in your group. You get to have ownership over what your little pocket of the church looks like and interact and participate in a way that hopefully is empowering and encouraging and mobilizing. You also get to contextualize what we're talking about Sundays or whatever it is that you guys might be digging into or learning about, both personally in your own life. You get to kind of bring the word and the gospel to bear on individual people in your group in a deeper way, more intimate way than you really could on a Sunday morning or other venues. So you get to do that there. You also get to contextualize for your neighborhood. So if there's application that's mission-oriented, that's community-oriented, outward-oriented, you get to consider what that looks like in your neighborhood versus like considering what that looks like in another person's neighborhood, right? A Liberty Township group might be a little bit different than a Westchester or a Hamilton group or a fill-in-the-blank group. And so we get to contextualize what it looks like for us to follow and obey and express the gospel and community in our particular neck of the woods. So diversity is a big deal. That's something that we get to experience. There's proximity is the thing that we would encourage folks to consider when joining a group, how close they are, for lots of logistical reasons. Being able to rub shoulders, being closer by, being able to have some shared neighbors potentially, all kinds of stuff. But that means that we're not just grouping people together based on age group or affinity or interest, but we're grouping people together based on their proximity, their ability to do mission and live life together. So diversity is a thing. And lastly, just mission, right? So we get to have groups that are front doors to the church just as much as a Sunday morning gathering might be. Some folks who are maybe opposed to the gospel or haven't set foot in a church ever or for a long time might be more prone to showing up to a group gathering than coming and setting foot in, even though we're not in a traditional church building, in the 210, right? So it's also a front door for mission as well. So at the end of the day, you could take all those things, and there's certainly more things that are good and ways that groups fit into the life and mission of the church. You could all roll those up into the three devotions that Luke points to in the very first verse of that passage we read in Acts 2. It's verse 42. He says, the early church was devoted to the apostles' teaching, which is the word, to the fellowship, to each other, and to the breaking of bread and the prayers, which is like corporate worship, giving thanks to God, loving God, all of those things. And so everything else that happens in that passage flows out from them being devoted to those three things, including even, folks being added to their number day by day, those who were being saved, because being devoted to those three things, the word, being devoted to each other, and fellowship, being devoted to thanking God and loving God and worshiping Him together, those devotions to those three things prep people's hearts to live among each other and live among their neighbors in a way that draws people into the church, right? And so we want to make space for those three things as well. And so we make space in our groups to be under the Word together as disciples, digging into the Word together, figuring out what that looks like in our lives. We get to make space to be around the table together as family, just making space to know each other, to get to know what's going on, to make space to build friendships and establish relationships that lay the groundwork for us to know how to speak the gospel and the Word into each other's lives, to know how to care for people. And then we also want to be among neighbors. And so we want to either make space for folks to come in or be where our neighbors are, so that we can be a light in our neighborhoods or in our communities. So all that to be said, we can't hit on all those things every single week. We'll talk more about that in a video that focuses on group gatherings. So just like our groups themselves aren't one-stop shops, our gatherings aren't either, and you guys aren't either as future leaders. You're not going to be the resident expert in missionary stuff or in teaching and preaching or in hospitality or in prayer or in fill in the blank. You get to rely on the other people in your group to do that. We'll talk more about that as well when it comes to what a leader does and what that looks like. So all that to say, I want to encourage you guys to, as a little bit of homework, to simply reflect. Your definition of what a community group was at the very beginning of the video, how does that line up with what we talked about here? So reflect on that, jot that down, reflect on that, reflect on your own experiences within a community group, whether that's in the village or outside of that. What have those been? And then the third thing is reflect on how those experiences shape both your current participation in your group. How does that shape the way you interact with your group right now? And maybe even more importantly, how do you think that's going to influence and shape the way that you lead a group in the future? So how does your first definition line up with what we talked about? What have your experiences been with group? Like, reflect on that. And how's that shaping your current participation and maybe future leadership of a group moving forward? So that's your homework. Thanks for watching this, guys. There'll be more videos coming down the line. Thanks.